Welcome to Diverse Orange, our conversations about diversity here in Central Florida. My guest today is Amel Okoye. Amel, good evening. How are you?
Good evening. I'm well. I'm excited. How are you doing?
I'm good. Well, let's start from the beginning. Where are you from, or where's your family from?
Haha. I'm originally from San Diego, California. My dad's actually from Orlando, Florida. My mom's is from San Diego, but I was born there.
Okay, so California person.
Yes, California, coast to coast.
Okay, and what have you seen as? What's the difference between California and Florida?
Hmm. There's major differences and then there's like major similarities. It's funny. You have beaches on both ends, so that's always a plus. I love that. Completely different types of beaches. It's almost like cliffs and shores and very different palm trees, whereas here it's kind of harder to find like cliffs. Um, and then in terms of like diversity, there's larger amounts of certain communities more than other, at least from what I've seen in Central Florida. So it's just the diversity is a little bit different also because of the proximity to Mexico is a major difference in sort of those subcultures that have sort of been born and bred out of California, kind of like any other place. Um, I don't know, it has its own like laid back kind of energy. The mountains is an entirely different terrain
Hmm.
than what we have here. Hot but breezy, hot but muggy. It's similarities with its own dualities.
And where did you mostly grow up?
Huh, that's complicated. um at this point it kind of equals out even Steven between both. More consecutive time in California though.
Okay. And so Amel Okoye, I
Yeah.
don't know any other Okoyes. Where does that name come from?
Okoye is actually a Nigerian last name. Although I'm not Nigerian. So that's a tale.
Okay.
Right.
Do your parents know from whence their heritage springs?
Some of which, yeah. The short story is they started doing a bit of like a lineage and research journey, probably around the time they were my age to like their early 30s. And that sort of sparked a bit of, some very concrete beliefs and deciding that, names that were closer to the heritage that would have been their original heritage, so to speak, off the west coast of Africa and in various different countries there with the transatlantic slave trade was the kinds of names they wanted to pick for their children. And so that's what they then went about doing, and that I'm a product of.
And how did you feel about that name as you grew up?
Huh, I had to grow into it, is the funny part. I kind of grew up a little bit all over the place. Like although I grew up between greater Central Florida and San Diego primarily, I had stints where I lived abroad for about 2 years of my upbringing. Um, and just some, different like cultural differences and things within my family. So at first it wasn't a name that I loved. I never disliked it, but a lot of people, it would almost feel like they deliberately mispronounced it. So it would be like a lot of pronunciation issues, or can spell it out 3 times at Starbucks and they still get it wrong. And so there was a lot of that for a really long time. And I feel like just into my late teens to like early 20s, I sort of had like a more of like a falling in love like with my name. I never disliked it, but it was always I felt like I met it more with challenge before I met it with love, if that kind of makes sense.
And so the circles that you grew up in, were you military? Was that why you were moving around?
No,
Okay.
I just had explorer parents who, through which part of it, it's sort of like is a domino effect and a linked story. Through sort of that lineage journey and doing, a lot of research into their lineages and things of that nature, it made them want to explore those parts of the world and also explore countries outside the US just to experience, different cost of living and some of the reasons that you probably commonly hear from people who are not military who choose to go abroad if they're not from another country. And so they chose to do that, when I was really young. I lived in Ghana for 9 months to a year, for a period. And then later on in my teen years, I lived in Belize, which is in Central America. It's bordering like Guatemala and Mexico, for a period as well. So they just always wanted to venture out and seek out something a bit different to what their normal was.
And in any of those places, did you feel um, not welcome by people around you?
Yeah, of course. Both experiences and everywhere I've honestly been and lived has always been a mixed bag. Some places more than others, but in terms of my international like third culture kid living at an earlier age, I definitely felt, not to get too deep into it, but I definitely felt like living in Ghana at the period when I lived there. I was 9 years old, eight turning nine, going there, and um it was a 50-50 experience where half of the experience was except extremely welcoming, almost like a long lost child, given the history in the world for the most part, with the transatlantic slave trade. But the other end of that was sort of like, oh, you're kind of like a little hybrid now. You have a completely different culture that you've curated and adopted, all because you have a whole new land as a home for generations now. So it's not at all the same when you're black of any other area of like the diaspora. I definitely experienced that kind of stark difference in treatment as a kid, and then other experiences I had were lovely. So I'm definitely a product of that mixed bag.
Yeah, it's a very interesting background.
Yeah.
And how would that say that affected you as far as how you relate to the world around you today?
Mm. As I'm getting older and just experiencing more, I sort of recognize a lot more of like how it affects me and how I look at things. I try to look at a bit more of the positive side. Um, it's not hard for me, I would say, to like mingle in a room that looks like a little bit of everybody, if that makes sense. I kind of enjoy those spaces. I think not in part because I always enjoy them, simply because I got so used to, you kind of get so used to always kind of being the new kid wherever you're the new kid, that you just sort of learn to adapt, and improvise, adapt, and like overcome in that circumstance. So meeting new faces is really cool to me. Like learning about other people's culture is really cool to me. I love traveling in general, even leisure now. I work in the travel industry even now. So in that side of it, I 100% love it. I think it cultivated me to be very open-minded and to be able to adapt to things a lot quicker. Is how I think it affected me. And be very like open to people and sort of have that eye for things. Um, on another token, I think it kind of, um, in another sense, at least from like the moving around, it's kind of hard to sort of lay a flag down and call a particular place home sometimes. So I've sort of narrowed it down as a young adult with being San Diego or from coast to coast, even though, as you can tell, that the story is a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah. So, how do you deal with someone when you meet that is not open-minded?
It depends on what kind of non-open-mindedness we're speaking about. Um, uh, uh, it's complicated, it's challenging, but I think for me, one thing the last couple of years I think I've landed on that's made it a bit easier. You can only meet people as deep as they're willing to meet you. So if you're, only willing to sort of meet me on a certain level, or it might not be bad, but we may only get to a certain level to talk about certain conversations. You don't talk astrophysics with just anyone necessarily.
Do
Um,
you talk astrophysics with people?
if they want to talk astrophysics with me, I'm open.
Mm.
I'd love to learn. I think that's very intriguing. But when it comes to like, there are people, that I don't know the percentage, but who really love to travel and want to travel. And there are people who have no desire to maybe leave their hometown or have never left their home city, and they might have an envy towards that, or genuinely just no interest at all. And that wouldn't be like the base I start on with you if I kind of get those inklings from things a person has said. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's all personally how we choose to walk our paths in life. I meet people where they meet me as as delicately and as genuine as I possibly can.
Well, that sounds good. And we are delighted to have you here in Central Florida. I hope you are feeling Central Florida is a home for you,
Yeah.
even though you may have more than one.
Yeah.
One heart home. So we're glad that. And thank you for coming on and talking to me a little bit about this and your and crazy moving all over the world growing upness. We appreciate it, Amel.
Well, thank you for taking out the time. I enjoyed the conversation.
Good. And thank you for watching this edition of Diverse Orange.